Now that we have replication configured and all the other settings set appropriately for these two servers in these two different locations, we can now go about making some changes to that DFSN link that we created just a second ago. If you recall back earlier in this module, we took a look at DFS namespaces, and we created here under company.pri/everything this link called company shared. And I also kind of teased a bit that a little further on here now, we would talk about how to actually make this a fault-tolerant link as well. Well, when we first configured this, we only had one copy of the data, and so that single copy of the data existed over here on our server file1. We now have two copies of this data. So depending on where that user is, depending on which Active Directory site they may happen to be in, we can now configure a fault-tolerant link to direct them to the alternative site if their existing and local DFSR server is no longer listening or functioning. There are a couple ways in which we can do that. I want to show you one way, and then we'll go through the wizard way just so you can see it. One way in which you can accomplish this is by right-clicking and choosing to add an additional folder target onto the ones that have been configured here for this DFS namespace. If I were to browse and then change this from file1 over to file2, that would give me the shared folders that I could then add here into the existing DFSN or DFS namespace. If I choose OK here and then OK, that would then add it in as an additional target we could include. But what I want to show you here is instead perhaps a slightly different way to accomplish the very same thing. Let me right-click here and delete out this company shared location from the namespace. And then with that now completed, I want to come back here to the company shared replication team or replication group that we created before. You'll notice over here under the replicated folders tab, we have the publication status for this replication group set to not published. It's here where we can actually use a nice little wizard to share this location and publish it in an existing namespace. Here we'll share and publish that replicated folder in the namespace. We'll identify which of the two servers we're interested in, which is file1 and file2. And for either, we want to identify that it's an existing shared folder. So there's really nothing new that we're doing here. We're just publishing the existing folder that we worked with before. Once we do that, we can choose the next button over here and identify which parent folder in the namespace we want to attach these two servers and the shares to. If I choose Browse, then I can identify this company.pri/everything namespace that we created earlier, and we'll just give it the same folder name as before, Company Shared. If I choose Next and then Share, that goes about actually creating now this fault-tolerant namespace that occurs across both of these two different servers. What this allows me to do now is for users in whatever location is appropriate for them to point first to the server in their Active Directory site, and then alternatively to point to the server in the other site if they can't access the data in their own. That configuration happens back under DFSN, where we can configure things both on the original root namespace and then on the folder that we attached. First, let's come back up here to Properties, and under the Referrals tab, we can determine what the ordering method is going to be for clients that cannot access the file server that happens to be in their Active Directory site. So we're talking a bit here about sites and services. I'll admit that includes some content you won't talk more about until the 7412. But let's assume, for example, that in this case, we had more than one Active Directory site that made up our domain. Maybe we had multiple different sites that correspond with a Denver, a Las Vegas, and a Phoenix geographic location. Well, the connection between those sites provides us a way to determine how we should actually redirect users to a different file server in a different site when they cannot access the file server that happens to be in their local site. Do we want to use the server that has the lowest cost setting? Now, this is an Active Directory cost setting. Should we choose a random order and essentially distribute the load out to different servers? Or should we actually exclude targets that happen to be outside the client's site? So if you can't access your server in your site, well, you're not allowed to then access any of the servers outside of that site. By default here, we're going to choose the lowest cost setting, which is again an Active Directory sites and services setting we'll talk more about in the 412 content. When I do that, I have the option to select whether we'll fail back then to the preferred target, or essentially in my local Active Directory site if I need to. Once I've configured these here for the root namespace, well then back up here under the folder, I can make some additional configurations again under the Referrals tab. So for each folder then, do I want to have special configurations as well, like to exclude targets outside of the client's site, or to fail back to preferred targets if I want to? This gives me a pretty discrete control over which folders users will be able to access should they lose the file server in their Active Directory site. If you think about certain folders that have really large quantities of data or really big files over a low latent network connection, you might want to exclude those from users being able to connect to them. The net result would be that users would still be able to have fault tolerance for their connection to their folders, but the amount of time it would take to copy that content to this local site over that latent connection is perhaps more than the users would just simply tolerate. So you have to be kind of careful here with these referral settings so that you don't end up creating a cascading problem that starts with the loss of a server in your local Active Directory site. And again, we're talking about sites and services here. We won't talk more about them until we get into the 412 content next, but all of this presupposes that the different file servers that you're working with happen to be positioned in different Active Directory sites, which we haven't really done here yet.